Hello everyone, I'm Priyadarshini Mara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, University of Delhi. Today, I'm going to talk to you about module number 24, which belongs to paper number 11, Philosophy of Buddhism. This module is titled as Yogacar Buddhism, Refutation of External Objects. As you've seen or read in the other modules, we've already talked about the Yogacar school. But before beginning into the main title, which is Refutation of the External Objects, let me give you an introduction. When we look at Buddhism as a religion, it came to be divided after the passing away of its founder into two schools or two main religious sects, which is Hinayan and Mahayana. Hinayan further bifurcated into two. One was Madhyamik, there is reality, mental and non-mental, all is void. So according to them, the reality which is termed as mental and non-mental, it is all void. So there is no such reality as mental or non-mental. And the other school that came out was Yogacar. They said that only mental is real. So we see the difference. Though both these schools belong to the Mahayana sect, we see that Madhyamik says that neither mental is real nor non-mental. So when we say non-mental, we're talking about the external phenomena that lies beyond the capacity of mental constructions. But for Yogacar school, we see that according to them, only mental is real. The main writers of Yogacar school are, one is Asang, he wrote Mahayana Sutra Lankar. And the other one is Vasabandhu, who wrote Vidya-mitra Siddhi. Then we have Vasabandhu was a Sarvastivadin thinker. In the influence of Asang, he moved to Yogacar. So these are the two main scholars of Yogacar school who are profoundly known all around, and they are Asang and Vasabandhu. Then it is generally believed that Asang is the founder of this school, but it secures Maitrinath to be the teacher of Asang and not Asang is the real founder or taken to be the founder of Yogacar school. But even Maitrinath cannot be taken as its founder. Why? Because Mahayana or Sarvastivad was already present in Lankavatara Sutra and in Ashwaghosh's work, and it can be said that Maitrinath was termed as the systematic expounder and not the founder of Yogacar school. So when we talk about Maitrinath, we see that first people find Asang to be the founder of Yogacar school, but it is believed that Maitrinath, who was a teacher of Asang, was the real founder. Then it is said that the Yogacar school was already present in Ashwaghosh's work, and therefore Maitrinath is termed to be the expounder or the systematic expounder of Yogacar school. The school is called Yogacar because it was that absolute truth is attainable only by practice of yoga. According to Yogacar, it means that the absolute truth or nirvana, which is the goal of all the schools of Buddhism, they say that it is attainable only by the practice of yoga. The term Yogacar brings out the practical side of philosophy, while the term Vigyanvad brings out the speculative side of philosophy. So when we talk about Yogacar and Vigyanvad, Yogacar school is also known as Vigyanvad school, and Yogacar points out to the practical side of philosophy, whereas Vigyanvad points out to the speculative side of philosophy. While arguing with the Madhyamiks as to the unreality of external objects, the Yogacara differs from them in leading that the mind or chit cannot be regarded as unreal. Why do they differ from the Madhyamik in terming that mind or chit cannot be regarded as unreal, when on the other hand we have the Madhyamiks who believe that nothing is real, not even the mind or anything that lies outside it. The reality for Yogacara school, or according to Yogacara school, the reality of mind should at least be admitted in order to make correct thinking possible. So they believe or they hold up to the reality of mind or chit because they say that at least the reality of chit or the mind needs to be regarded or needs to be accepted in order to make any correct thinking possible, or in order to begin any correct thinking possible. According to the Yogacara school, when we talk about the refutation of objects, we see that why have we titled this paper as Yogacara Buddhism, Refutation of External Objects. So now, do you get an idea why do we say refutation of external objects? Because, see, on one hand we have the external reality, on the other hand we have the internal mind, and according to Madhyamik, both does not exist. And according to Yogacara, it is only the external objects that does not exist. The mind constituting of a stream of different kinds of ideas is the only thing. Things that appear to be outside the mind, our body as well as other objects, are merely ideas of the mind. So according to Yogacara school, anything, then before we get into this, let me ask you a question. Now the question is, if everything that lies outside is unreal, then why do we talk about things, or how in fact can we talk about things? So they say, according to Yogacara, it is believed that anything that lies outside the mind, be it the body or any external object, is a mere idea of the mind. So just as a man functions or fancies to perceive things outside, though they do not really exist. Hence, similarly, the object that appear to be outside are really ideas in the mind. The existence of any external object shown that the object is different from consciousness of the object. So we see that the external object that's lying outside is different from the consciousness of an object. It is the mind that builds up that object. So we require the mind or we take the existence of the mind in order to make any thinking possible, in order to be able to define our things outside. So when we talk about a particular thing that lies external to the mind, we see that when a man fancies a particular thing, not necessary that it has to lie outside. Sometimes when we are in the state of dream or hallucination, so if we are hallucinating, that means that we are seeing something that does not exist. So the term hallucination points out to the existence of something which is really not there. But we see it to be there, or we perceive it to be there. So what is this thing that is not there but yet we are thinking about it? It's a kind of psychological disorder, but here what we're trying to say by using this term hallucination is that when we say hallucination, when a man hallucinates or dreams for that matter, there's nothing that's lying outside. It's all his mental construction. So they're trying to point out that this mental construction is what leads to the further understanding of the phenomenal existence. So anything that lies outside is refuted on the terms that it is only the mind or the concepts of the mind. The mind is building up an idea. Now, we see that the Yogacar school gives 8 types of consciousness. So when we talk about these 8 types of consciousness, what are these 8 types of consciousness? One is the eye consciousness. Second is the ear consciousness. Third is the nose consciousness. Then we have the tongue consciousness. Then we have body consciousness. Then comes mind or the consciousness of ideation. Then comes Klisht Manovinyan, which means obscure or complicated mind. And in the end, the 8th type of consciousness is called Alya Vinyan or storehouse of all the above. So, when we talk about 8 types of consciousness, we see that there are sense organs, which is eye, ear, nose, tongue and body. So, the consciousness that arises of these sense organs is included in these 8 types of consciousness, and the other 3 being mind, the consciousness of ideation. Klisht Manovinyan, which is obscure or complicated mind, and then we have Alya Vinyan, which means storehouse of all the above. Moving further into these 8 types of consciousness, we see that the first 6 are also individual consciousness known as Pravrti Vinyan, and the last 2, which is Klisht Manovinyan and Alya Vinyan, they together are known as pure transcendental knowledge. Further, if we look into the categorization of these 8 kinds of consciousness, we see that Yogacar categorize mind into 3 types, and that is the mind, which is consciousness of ideation. Then we have complicated mind, which is Klisht Manovinyan. And then the third one is the storehouse mind, which is known as Alya Vinyan. So the first is mind, which is consciousness of ideation. Second is complicated mind, which is known as Klisht Manovinyan. And the third is storehouse mind, which is known as Alya Vinyan. Now, when we talk about refutation of the external objects, we see that the Yogacar points out to the following, which arises from the admission of an object extended to the mind. An external object which is composite must be either partless, that is atomic, or composite, that is compound of many objects. But atoms are too small to be perceived. Let us take an example here. By this, what we are trying to say is that the admission of an external object to the mind, we see that an external object, if admitted, must be either partless, that is atomic, or composite, that is compound of many objects. For an example, we see that a composite thing like a pot also cannot be perceived because it is not possible to perceive simultaneously all sides of the object, all the parts of an object, nor is it possible to perceive part by part or to perceive that particular object part by part, because if we do that, then parts are atomic. They are too small to be perceived by the naked eyes. So, if one admits extra mental objects, their perception of these objects cannot be explained. When we talk about perceiving extra mental objects, we cannot really explain the perception of these objects. Thus, objects do not arise if the object is nothing other than consciousness, because the question of parts and whole does not arise with regard to consciousness. When we talk about parts and whole, the whole idea of parts and whole does not arise with regard to consciousness. Now, another difficulty is that consciousness of the object cannot arise before the object has come into existence. When we talk about consciousness of the object, we see that it cannot really arise before the object has come into existence. Until and unless you haven't seen the object or you haven't experienced the object, how can you say that the consciousness of that particular object has arisen? Now, we see that if object arises afterwards, because the object being momentary, it passes as soon as it arises. This cannot be visible or vanishes as soon as it arises, and this particular thing is not visible according to the doctrine of Yogacara. Being the cause of consciousness, it cannot really arise simultaneously with consciousness, nor can it be said that the object may be known by consciousness after the object has ceased to exist. It cannot arise before the object. It cannot be present simultaneously with the object, because object changes every moment, and it cannot be said that the consciousness has arisen after the object has ceased to exist, or in that case the object being in the past, their perception, or there cannot be any immediate knowledge of perception of that object. So we say that the object was in the past. So how can you talk about the immediate knowledge of that object in the present? That is the case when we say that the consciousness cannot arise after the object has ceased to exist. So can you see this difficulty which we're talking about has been tackled in a very sensible way by the Yogacharans. They say that you cannot say the consciousness of the object arises with the object, or simultaneously with the object, or arises after the object has ceased to exist. Perception of present objects, as we must admit, always have to remain, therefore, unexplained if objects are suffered to be external to the mind. The difficulty does not arise if the object is supposed to be nothing other than consciousness. The Yogacharans state that there is no need to get into such a contradictory feature or the complex feature if the object is supposed to be nothing other than the consciousness itself. The Yogacara school gives the theory of three swabhav, which means the three nature or three characteristics. When we talk about three swabhav, it is the term that has been used in order to define three characteristics or three natures. It is the three nature of perception. When we talk about three swabhav, the way we perceive, it points out to those three natures of perception, or the three basic modes by which we perceive the world. So what are these three basic modes? I guess that you have already studied about three swabhav in previous modules. So you would be able to answer that what are these three basic modes by which we perceive the world. But let me just repeat them again for you. One is parikalpit, which means imaginary, or it can also be said that all the conceptual constructions are termed under parikalpit. Second, we have paratantra, which means dependent. So here what we're pointing out to is the dependent origination of things is understood by paratantra. Then we have parinispan, which means transcendental. So apprehension of things as they are in themselves is termed as Parinispan. So these three modes or three swabhav of perception are Parikalpit, Paratantra and Parinispan. Parikalpit points out to conceptual construction. Paratantra points out to the dependent origination of all the phenomenal existence, and Parinispan is that state of higher existence where you apprehend things as they are in themselves. So here we see that the first two are Samvriti Satya. If you remember, then we've already talked about the law of two truths, or maybe in future modules you would be studying about these two truths which Nagarjuna has given. Nagarjuna was a Madhyamik scholar. He talks about two truths, and these two truths are, one is the empirical truth, which means Samvriti Satya, and the other is the absolute truth, which means Paramarth Satya. So he divides the entire phenomenal existence as well as the absolute into two, the Samvriti and Paramarth. So what we are trying to state here is that the first two are Samvriti Satya, which means empirical knowledge, and the third one is Paramarth Satya, which means transcendental knowledge. Therefore, when we talk about Parikalpit and Paratantra, we see that they both belong to empirical knowledge, which points out to the conditioned nature and to the impermanent nature of the existential phenomena. And when we talk about Parinispan, it means the transcendental knowledge or pure knowledge. Now, we see that the Yogacar view is called Vigyanvad or idealism. Why is it called Vigyanvad or idealism? This is again related to the refutation of external objects, because it admits that there is only one kind of reality, which is of the nature of consciousness, and that consciousness is known as Vinyan. And any object or objects which appear to be external to consciousness are really ideas or states of consciousness. So we see that why do they refute the external reality, and why is it called idealism? Because it admits that there is only the nature of consciousness, which is known as Vinyan, and objects which lie outside or which appear to be rational or external to consciousness are really ideas or states of consciousness. This, therefore, or this theory may be described further as subjective idealism. Why is it called subjective idealism? It is subjective idealism because according to the existence of an object, perceived is not different from the subject or the perceiving mind. When we're talking about the object, it is whatever is perceived is what is subject to the perceiving mind. There is nothing that lies beyond this perceiving mind. So, it is the subject or the perceiving mind itself that defines a particular object in form of external objects. So, everything depends on this perceiving mind. Anything that lies outside is only a part of that perceiving mind, or is only the idea of that perceiving mind. One of the chief difficulties of subjective idealism is if an object depends for its existence solely on the subject, then how is that the mind cannot create at will any object at any time? Now listen to this carefully. When we talk about subjective idealism, one chief difficulty that arises is that if an object depends for its existence solely at the subject, then how is that the mind cannot create at any will any object at any time. To explain this difficulty, the Vidya-mitra says that the mind is a stream of momentary mind. When we're talking about it, is the stream of momentary ideas. So when we talk about the mind, we see that it belongs to the stream of momentary ideas, and it is through culture and self-control that Alya Vinyan, or the potential mind, can gradually stop the arising of undesirable mental states. When we look at the mind, we see that it cannot produce anything at its own will. And why is that so? It is so because through culture and self-control, the mind is formulated, or the mind is kept under control. We see that we have Alya Vinyan, which is known as the storehouse consciousness, and this storehouse consciousness develops an understanding or self-control and leads the mind to comprehend or apprehend the reality that lies outside. Through this culture and self-control, the Alya Vinyan, or potential mind, can gradually stop the arising of undesirable mental states and develop into the ideal state of nirvana. When we talk about Yogacara Buddhism, first of all we see that they talk about the existence or the reality of only mental phenomena. For them to say that only mental is real and refute the external or any entity that lies outside the mind, be it body or any external object, it is to say that this is unreal, or this in fact does not really exist. So when we say that anything that is beyond or outside the mind does not exist, so how can we talk about things around us? If they don't really exist, then how is it possible to communicate or to talk about things that are beyond? So for this they say that when we are talking about the external entities, it is the mind that is playing essential role, or in fact it is only the mind that's playing the role, and the mind is playing the role of constructing these external entities. These external entities are developed in a constructive way in mental constructions or conceptual constructions. And why do we construct these external objects? Why do we talk about these external objects? In order to make our verbal communication possible. That is the reason we talk about these external objects. Now let us take an example. If I ask you to get me a chair, and instead of a chair you get me a table, then I would be either laughing at you or I would scold you that I asked you to get a chair and you got me a table. So there has to be this understanding, and for this understanding we've given or assigned different names to different objects around us. And it is important in order for our verbal communication as human beings to be possible that we term or we have these objective terms for everything around us. When these objective terms are placed on the objects around us, it is merely an understanding or verbal communication. There is nothing more according to Yogacara Buddhism. For them, it is only mind that functions. And even if you see, when we term these objects, we are using our mind in order to construct a particular form and name. Suppose there is a particular pot. And so now that we know a pot is used to keep water, and a pot is made up of clay. So we know the characteristics, we know its actions, and we know all the attributes that can be laid to it. And that is the reason anything that stores water, anything that is made up of a clay in a particular shape, we call it a pot. So we know, we are aware of these particular characteristics, attributes, actions, and the value or the use of that thing, and that is the reason we have a name for it. This likewise, when we look at things around us, we see that according to our understanding of those things, we have given them different names, and these names are just for us to communicate, so that if I ask you to get me a pot tomorrow, then you get me a pot only and not a glass. There is a difference between every object, and there is a different name and form of that object. According to all its attributes and these characteristics, we give a particular name to these different forms existing around us. But if you see, in reality, everything is impermanent and everything is dependent on many other factors for its existence. As for that matter, when you talk about a girl whose name would be Alicia, so this girl Alicia has certain characteristics. She has a name which is Alicia, and she looks, or she has a certain form, and she looks in a certain way. So when I give you the description of so and so girl who plays this and that game, who is a dancer maybe, and other such attributes, you would be able to guess whom I'm talking about, and you would say that it is Alicia that I'm talking about. Now see, if you remove all these attributes, if you remove all the characteristics from Alicia, would she still be Alicia? No, because all these characteristics that we have combined or formed in order to make our understanding possible, we are removing those characteristics. We are taking away all those attributes, and that is the reason you would not be able to talk about that girl, or you would not be able to guess who that girl is. That could be any random girl. So we see, when we talk about the refutation of external objects, it is done on basis of certain conditions and factors, and it is said that it is only the mind that leads you to the attainment of this verbal understanding. Therefore, otherwise it only gives rise to thoughts, desires, attachment, which binds one more and more to the fictional external world. Therefore, the mind is the only reality according to Yogacara Buddhism, and they refute the existence of any external object. When we talk about external objects, they are only mental constructions or conceptual constructions. And this is what Yogacara Buddhism points out to when it says the refutation of external realities. Thank you.